Dust settled over blood-stained boots. Silence choked every breath inside sweaty saloon walls. Everyone warned him. "Don't look there," whispered frightened voices. But Wyatt kept staring. He stepped forward. He did something unforgivable. Chaos erupted instantly. Lives shattered forever under brutal desert heat. Betrayal leaves deep, permanent scars. The brutal summer heat of 1888 baked the sprawling frontier town of Mercer's Crossing until the very air seemed to shimmer with hostility. Dust coated everything: the wooden boardwalks, the hitching posts, and the weary faces of the men who drove cattle through the unforgiving valley. Yet inside the grand ballroom of the Silver Spur Hotel, an entirely different world had been artificially constructed. Velvet curtains blocked out the harsh sun. Hundreds of imported beeswax candles flickered in crystal chandeliers, and the air was thick with the scent of French perfume and expensive Cuban cigars. This was the domain of Josiah Montgomery, a cattle baron whose wealth was measured in blood, land, and the sheer terror he instilled in the local populace. Tonight, Josiah was hosting the event of the decade, the engagement ball of his only daughter, Josephine Montgomery, to Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was not a man of the West. He was an East Coast railroad tycoon with soft hands, tailored silk suits, and a reputation for a cruelty so refined it made the local outlaws look like gentlemen. The marriage was a blatant business transaction. Josiah needed the railroad to run through his land to monopolize the beef trade, and Arthur needed the Montgomery acreage. Josephine was merely the ink on the contract. Up on the sweeping mahogany balcony overlooking the crowded ballroom floor, Josephine stood trapped in her own personal purgatory. She was a vision of tragic beauty, encased in a $1,000 Parisian silk gown that was heavy, restrictive, and entirely unsuited for the suffocating heat of the territory. Arthur possessed a violent jealousy, treating Josephine not as a partner, but as a prized thoroughbred to be guarded behind high fences. He had established an unspoken but heavily enforced rule in Mercer's Crossing: no man of lower station was to speak to, approach, or even look at his future bride. Just 3 days prior, a young stable hand had been severely beaten by Arthur's hired Pinkerton guards, merely for failing to lower his eyes when Josephine's carriage rolled past. The townsfolk had learned quickly. When Josephine Montgomery was in the room, you kept your eyes fixed firmly on the floor. The orchestra played a lively waltz, but the atmosphere among the local ranchers and townsfolk, invited to fill the back of the room, was intensely strained. They drank Josiah's whiskey, nodded at his boasts, and carefully avoided looking up at the balcony where Arthur stood proudly beside his trembling prize. Then the saloon doors at the back of the hotel swung open. Wyatt Sterling walked into the suffocating opulence of the Silver Spur, bringing the harsh reality of the frontier in with him. Wyatt was a drifter, a man whose reputation preceded him in whispered rumors around campfires. He was tall, his broad shoulders shifting beneath a dust-caked canvas duster. A worn Colt revolver rested with easy familiarity on his hip, its wooden handle smoothed by years of desperate use. Beneath the brim of his Stetson, his eyes were the color of a winter storm cold, calculating and entirely unafraid. He didn't belong in this room. He smelled of horsesweat, leather, and gunpowder, a stark contrast to the cloying floral scents of the ballroom. Wyatt strode past the bewildered doorman, moving with the slow, predatory grace of a cougar stalking through dry brush. He made his way to the long, polished oak bar, dropping a silver dollar onto the wood. "Whiskey," Wyatt murmured, his voice a low gravel scrape that barely carried over the music. "Leave the bottle." Old Jeb, the bartender, quickly slid a glass and a bottle of rye toward the stranger, his hand shaking slightly. Jeb knew a dangerous man when he saw one. "Drink up, stranger, but mind your manners," Jeb whispered urgently, leaning across the damp wood. "And whatever you do, don't look up at the balcony. Pendleton's men are itching for a reason to draw blood tonight." Wyatt poured his drink, the amber liquid catching the candlelight. He didn't answer. Instead, he lifted the glass, tilted his head back, and let his gaze sweep the room. His eyes traveled over the dancing couples, the sycophantic politicians, and the heavily armed guards lining the walls, and then his eyes drifted upward. They stopped on the balcony. They stopped on Josephine. "Lord Almighty," Jeb hissed, ducking down behind the bar as if bullets were already flying. "I told you, don't look there." But Wyatt kept staring. Up on the landing, Josephine felt the weight of that gaze. In a room full of people deliberately ignoring her existence to save their own hides, Wyatt's stare was like a physical touch. She turned her head slightly, her breath hitching against the crushing restriction of her corset. She looked down and found him. Through the sea of shifting bodies and swirling cigar smoke, their eyes locked. Time seemed to fracture. For Josephine, the suffocating heat, the awful pressure of her father's expectations, and the lingering dread of Arthur's touch all momentarily vanished. She saw a man who wasn't looking at her the way Arthur did, like a possession. Wyatt was looking at her with a profound, piercing understanding. He saw the slight sway of her stance. He saw the deathly pallor of her skin beneath the blush. He saw the sheer, unadulterated panic in her eyes. Wyatt stared, did not waver. He stood at the bar, his drink forgotten, his thumb resting casually on the brass buckle of his gun belt. The silence in his immediate vicinity began to spread like a contagion. First, the men at the bar stopped talking, noticing the stranger's blatant defiance. Then the women nearby noticed the men looking, and they turned to see what had captured the drifter's attention. One by one, the patrons realized what was happening. A drifter was openly, brazenly staring at Arthur Pendleton's bride. The whispers began, frantic and fearful. Couples stopped dancing. The tension in the room grew so thick it could be carved with a blade. Even the orchestra, sensing the sudden shift in the room's energy, began to falter, the notes of the waltz becoming disjointed and weak. "Avert your eyes, boy," whispered a local rancher, standing a few feet from Wyatt. "You're signing your own death warrant." Wyatt ignored him. His stormy eyes remained locked on Josephine. He could see her chest heaving in short, shallow bursts. He noticed the way her white-knuckled grip on the balcony railing was the only thing keeping her upright. The imported silk dress, laced impossibly tight by Arthur's explicit demand to highlight her waist, was slowly suffocating her in the sweltering heat of the packed ballroom. Arthur, deep in conversation with a bank manager, finally sensed the shift in the room. The music had died completely. The low hum of conversation had vanished. He turned, his arrogant smile faltering as he followed the collective gaze of the townsfolk down to the dusty stranger at the bar. Arthur's face flushed a violent, mottled crimson. The sheer audacity of the act was beyond his comprehension. "You there!" Arthur bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You filthy piece of frontier trash, turn your eyes to the floor before I have them cut from your skull." The room held its collective breath. Wyatt didn't look at Arthur. He didn't look at the 4 Pinkerton guards who immediately drew their batons and began shoving their way through the crowd toward the bar. He just kept staring at Josephine. And then slowly, deliberately, Wyatt pushed away from the oak bar. Wyatt's boots thudded loudly against the polished floorboards, the sound echoing like hammer strikes in the dead-silent ballroom. He wasn't retreating toward the saloon doors. He was walking directly toward the grand curving staircase that led to the VIP balcony. "Stop him!" Josiah Montgomery roared, finally realizing the severity of the insult happening under his own roof. "Shoot that insolent dog down." Two Pinkerton guards intercepted Wyatt at the base of the stairs. The first man swung a heavy wooden baton aimed squarely at Wyatt's temple. Wyatt didn't even break his stride. With terrifying speed, he ducked beneath the swing, drove his shoulder into the guard's chest, and used the man's own momentum to throw him brutally into a table of champagne glasses. Crystal shattered. Women screamed. The second guard reached for the revolver at his hip, but Wyatt's left hand shot out, gripping the man's wrist with the force of a steel vice. A sharp twist produced a sickening crack, and the guard collapsed to his knees, howling in agony. Wyatt stepped over him and began to climb the stairs. "What is the meaning of this?" Arthur shrieked, his refined composure completely shattering. He reached inside his tailored coat and produced a silver-plated derringer, aiming it with trembling hands at Wyatt's chest. "I will kill you. I will kill you where you stand." Josephine couldn't speak. Her vision was tunneling, gray spots dancing at the edges of her sight. The heat, the stress, and the brutal constriction of the whalebone corset had finally taken their toll. Her knees buckled. She swayed dangerously toward the edge of the balcony railing, a two-story drop to the hard floor below. Wyatt reached the landing. He didn't look at Arthur's gun. He didn't look at Josiah's furious red face. He closed the distance between himself and Josephine in 3 long strides, ignoring Arthur's terrified, misfired shot that went wild, burying itself in the ceiling plaster. Just as Josephine's eyes rolled back and gravity claimed her, Wyatt caught her. His strong, calloused arm wrapped securely around her waist, preventing her from hitting the floor. He pulled her against his chest, feeling the terrifying, the erratic flutter of her heart. She was gasping, desperate for air that her lungs simply could not expand to receive. "Get your filthy hands off my property," Arthur screamed, lunging forward. Wyatt shoved Arthur backward with an open palm to the chest, sending the wealthy tycoon crashing into an expensive floral arrangement. Then Wyatt did the unforgivable. In a society where a woman's modesty was her entire worth, where the exposure of an ankle was scandalous, and where a dress was a symbol of a man's wealth, Wyatt committed an act of supreme public desecration. With his right hand, Wyatt reached down to his belt and pulled his massive, razor-sharp Bowie knife from its leather sheath. The polished steel flashed menacingly in the chandelier light. A collective horrified gasp sucked all the remaining air out of the ballroom. Several women in the crowd fainted on the spot. Josiah Montgomery froze in absolute shock, fully believing he was about to witness the brutal murder of his daughter. But Wyatt didn't aim the blade at Josephine's throat. He spun her slightly, supporting her limp weight with his left arm, and drove the point of the heavy knife directly into the back of her $1,000 Parisian gown. With one violent upward jerk of his arm, Wyatt sliced right through the thick imported silk. The horrific sound of tearing fabric ripped through the silent room. He didn't stop there. The blade caught the heavy, unyielding laces of the whalebone corset beneath. With a powerful twist of his wrist, Wyatt severed the tightly knotted cords. Snap, snap, snap. The brutal restriction holding Josephine's ribs hostage gave way instantly. The rigid corset sprang open, exposing the delicate white cotton of her undergarments to the hundreds of staring eyes below. The physical relief was immediate and overwhelming. Josephine's lungs expanded violently, drawing in a massive, ragged breath of air. Her eyes snapped open wide and shocked as oxygen finally rushed back into her blood. She slumped against Wyatt's chest, panting heavily, alive but completely ruined in the eyes of society. The silence that followed was apocalyptic. Wyatt had not just touched another man's betrothed. He had destroyed a priceless garment, exposed her underclothes to the entire town, and fundamentally emasculated Arthur Pendleton in front of every business partner and rancher in the territory. It was an act of public intimacy and disrespect so profound that no one knew how to process it. "My God," Josiah whispered, his face draining of all color. "You've ruined her. You've ruined us." My belt. Rand. Arthur scrambled to his feet, his tailored suit covered in crushed flower petals and spilled water. His face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He pointed a trembling finger at Wyatt, spit flying from his lips. "You savage! You animal! Look what you've done to her dress! Do you know how much that cost? Do you know what you've done?" Wyatt slowly slid the Bowie knife back into its sheath. He looked down at Josephine, who was clutching the torn front of her dress against her chest, her breathing finally returning to normal. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with a chaotic mixture of terror, shock, and profound gratitude. Wyatt finally turned his cold, storm-gray eyes upon Arthur. "I know exactly what I did," Wyatt said, his voice carrying the dangerous calm before a hurricane. "She was dying in that trap you put her in. A man who binds a horse too tight is a fool. A man who does it to a woman is a monster." Arthur's jaw dropped. The sheer audacity of the insult left him temporarily speechless. "Guards!" Josiah Montgomery bellowed, his shock finally giving way to volcanic rage. "Every man with a badge or a gun, get up here. I want this drifter dead. I want him shot to pieces." Below them, the crowd erupted into absolute pandemonium. Men shouted, women screamed and rushed for the exits, and the heavy thud of boots on the stairs signaled the arrival of a dozen armed men. Sheriff Bo Callahan, a man whose badge was practically bought and paid for by the Montgomery fortune, pushed his way through the chaotic crowd, his Winchester rifle raised and ready. Wyatt stood his ground on the balcony. He didn't run. He didn't draw his coat. He simply kept his body positioned firmly between the rising mob and the still trembling Josephine. He had known the moment he looked up from his whiskey that this act would likely cost him his life. But feeling the steady rhythm of Josephine's breathing behind him, Wyatt knew with absolute certainty that he would do it all over again. The guns clicked into place, the trap was sprung. The real fight for Mercer's Crossing had just begun. Sheriff Bo Callahan's Winchester rifle clicked ominously as he reached the top step of the balcony. Behind him, a half-dozen hardened deputies and Montgomery ranch hands fanned out, their heavy revolvers drawn and leveled squarely at Wyatt's broad chest. The ballroom below had rapidly emptied of the faint-hearted, leaving only the rugged, sun-baked men of Mercer's Crossing to witness the impending slaughter. "Step away from the girl, Drifter," Bo growled, his finger tightening dangerously on the trigger. "You've got 5 seconds to make your peace with the Almighty. You don't lay a blade on Josiah Montgomery's kin and walk out of here breathing." Wyatt didn't raise his hands in surrender. He simply shifted his stance, keeping his physical frame as an impenetrable shield for Josephine, who still clung desperately to the back of his torn canvas duster. Her breathing was fast, but she pressed her cheek against the coarse fabric of his coat, finding the first moment of true safety she had felt in months. "You might want to ask your boss who he's doing business with before you go shooting up a federal officer, Bo," Wyatt stated, his low voice slicing effortlessly through the tension. The sheriff paused, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "What kind of lies are you spinning, boy?" Wyatt reached slowly, deliberately, into the inside pocket of his weathered duster. Several hammers cocked in harsh response, the metallic clacks echoing in the vaulted ceiling, but Wyatt's movements remained fluid and unthreatening. He withdrew a folded piece of heavy parchment, thick and official, sealed with dark red wax. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it to the floor. It landed precisely at Bo's dusty boots. "Federal warrant," Wyatt declared, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "Signed by Judge Isaac Parker out of Fort Smith. I'm a Deputy United States Marshal, under me, and the man you're all so eager to protect is wanted for the murder of 3 surveyors and the grand theft of payroll funds belonging to the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway." The shocked collective murmur rippled through the armed men. Judge Isaac Parker was a name that commanded absolute terror across the frontier. They called him the Hanging Judge for a reason. Josiah Montgomery's face morphed from volcanic rage to sheer bewilderment. He whipped his head toward his future son-in-law. What the hell is he talking about, Pendleton? Arthur's refined East Coast veneer completely dissolved, leaving a cornered, desperate animal in its place. The arrogant color drained entirely from his face, his eyes darting frantically toward the side exit of the balcony. It's a lie, a forgery concocted by jealous competitors. Shoot him, Josiah. I won't build the rail line through your valley if this man lives. Shoot him, no. But Josiah hesitated. A cattle baron survived the brutal Western expansion by being ruthless, but also by being fiercely pragmatic. Tangling with a nameless drifter was one thing. Murdering a deputy marshal bearing a warrant from Judge Parker would bring the full, unyielding force of the United States cavalry crashing down on Mercer's Crossing. "Pick up the paper, Bo," Josiah commanded gruffly, his eyes never leaving Arthur. As the sheriff cautiously bent down, keeping his rifle trained on Wyatt with one hand while grabbing the warrant with the other, Arthur's panic peaked. Knowing the document was undeniably authentic, and knowing Judge Parker's hemp rope awaited him in Arkansas, Arthur made a fatal miscalculation. He didn't attack Wyatt. Instead, he lunged forward and grabbed Josephine by her bare arm, violently yanking her out from behind Wyatt's protective stance. Josephine shrieked in terror as Arthur jammed the short, cruel barrel of his silver derringer directly against her temple. The torn Parisian silk of her ruined dress fluttered as she struggled frantically against his surprisingly strong, panicked grip. "Nobody moves," Arthur screamed, his voice cracking with shrill hysteria. "Drop the gun, Marshal. Drop it right now, or I swear to God I blow her brains out all over this imported wallpaper." "Arthur, have you lost your damn mind?" Josiah roared, stepping forward, his dormant paternal instincts finally overriding his insatiable greed. "Let my daughter go. You'll hang for this." "Shut up, old man," Arthur spat, dragging a struggling Josephine backward toward the rear stairs that led down to the dark alleyways. "You're nothing to me. Your land is mine, and she's nothing but leverage to get me out of this forsaken territory." "Drop the iron, Sterling." Wyatt's storm-gray eyes locked onto Arthur's terrified, sweating face. The air in the Silver Spur turned incredibly icy. Wyatt had hunted men like Arthur across 3 territories. They were exceptionally cruel when they held all the cards, but profound cowards when faced with real frontier grit. However, a panicked coward with a loaded gun was the most unpredictable creature on the earth. "Let her go, Pendleton," Wyatt said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. "You'll pull that trigger, and I promise you on my mother's grave you won't live to hear her hit the floor." "Drop it." Arthur shrieked again, his hand shaking violently as he pressed the gun harder against Josephine's head, leaving a red welt on her pale skin. Wyatt slowly raised his hands, his long fingers hovering mere inches above the smooth wooden grip of his Colt. He locked eyes with Josephine. Her breath was hitched, hot tears streaming down her cheeks, but as she looked into the steady, unwavering eyes of the Marshal, something fundamental shifted inside her. The suffocating fear and obedience that had defined her entire life vanished, replaced by a sudden, fierce flash of survival instinct. She was no longer willing to be a prisoner in a corset, a bargaining chip for her father, or a hostage to a madman. Josephine looked at Arthur, then stomped her heel down with every ounce of strength she possessed. The sharp, hard leather heel of her expensive dancing shoe drove directly into Arthur's instep, crushing the small bones of his foot. Arthur howled in agony, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. That fraction was all Wyatt Sterling needed. Wyatt's right hand became an invisible blur. The heavy Colt revolver cleared its worn leather holster, leveled and fired in one seamless, deafening motion. The gunshot boomed like raw thunder within the confined, opulent space of the balcony, shattering the crystal glass of a nearby chandelier. The silver derringer flew from Arthur's violently shattered hand. He collapsed backward against the wall, clutching his bleeding, mangled wrist, screaming in high-pitched agony. Josephine stumbled forward off balance, but Wyatt was there instantly. He caught her, pulling her tightly against his chest, shielding her from the gruesome sight of her former fiancé. Deafening silence crashed back into the ballroom, broken only by the tinny ringing in their ears and Arthur's pathetic whimpering on the floorboards. Sheriff Bo Callahan slowly lowered his Winchester, his eyes wide in utter disbelief, as he looked from the bleeding, ruined railroad tycoon to the imposing federal marshal. He had read the warrant. The federal seal was authentic. "Bo," Wyatt said calmly, sliding his smoking gun smoothly back into its holster, "take your prisoner into custody. And patch up that hand. Judge Parker strictly requested him alive for the gallows." Josiah Montgomery stood completely frozen, his grand empire of ambition and greed crumbling into dust before his very eyes. He looked at his daughter, her beautiful, expensive dress destroyed, her modesty compromised, standing willingly in the arms of a rugged lawman. Josephine, now Josiah, started, his voice hollow and suddenly sounding very old. "Come here. Get away from that man. We can still salvage your reputation." Josephine slowly pulled back from Wyatt, looking up into his rugged, soot-stained face. He offered her a small, respectful nod, a silent assurance that she was finally in control of her own destiny. Then she turned to face her father. "No," Josephine said. Her voice, usually a meek whisper designed to appease his temper, was incredibly clear and steady. She clutched the torn, jagged edges of her gown over her chest, no longer ashamed, that wearing the ruined fabric like a hard-won badge of honor. "You sold me to a monster for a strip of iron tracks, father. You stood by and ordered men to shoot while he put a gun to my head. Josephine, be reasonable. The scandal of this night, there is no scandal worse than the life you planned for me." She interrupted, her eyes burning with a newly ignited fire. She turned back to Wyatt, her chin held high. "Marshal Sterling, if your business here is concluded and you are riding back out, I would ask for your protection as far as the New Mexico border. I have an aunt in Santa Fe who will take me in." Wyatt looked at the fierce, determined woman standing before him. The fragile, suffocating porcelain doll from the balcony was entirely gone, replaced by a true woman of the West, forged in the chaotic crucible of a single violent night. A rare, genuine smile finally tugged at the corner of the marshal's lips. "It would be my supreme honor, ma'am," Wyatt replied softly. He offered her his arm, ignoring the shocked, gaping stares of her father, the sheriff, and the remaining townsfolk. Josephine Montgomery took it. Together they walked down the grand, curving staircase of the Silver Spur Hotel. They didn't look back at the shattered opulence, the spilled blood, or the broken expectations. They walked straight out through the swinging saloon doors, out into the warm, dusty frontier night, leaving the suffocating, gilded cage of Mercer's Crossing behind them forever. The next morning, the town awoke to find Arthur Pendleton securely locked in the sheriff's rusted iron cage, crying over his ruined hand, awaiting a long, miserable wagon ride to Arkansas. Without the railroad expansion, Josiah Montgomery's cattle empire slowly collapsed, his vast wealth drying up like a creek in midsummer. As for Wyatt and Josephine, rumors occasionally drifted back on the westerly winds. Some said she opened a thriving schoolhouse in Santa Fe. Others confidently claimed they were married by a circuit judge near the Pecos River, running a small, successful horse ranch of their own, far from the suffocating grasp of high society. Whatever the real truth was, one fact remained a legendary campfire tale across the territory. The night a lone lawman stared when he shouldn't have, cut a woman free, and proved that a man's true worth is measured by the iron in his blood. Did you love this thrilling tale of Wild West justice and unexpected romance? If Wyatt's daring rescue left you breathless, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this incredible story with your friends and family who love historical drama. Subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on more epic, real-life inspired stories from the untamed frontier. See you next time.